session with Tammy Boone, Developing and Enhancing Substance Policies, Part 382. So I'm glad that you're all here. I'm JJ, I'm with the TREDS program here at UC San Diego. And I will go ahead and introduce Tammy. Tammy Boone gained her transportation compliance expertise from over 35 years of transportation industry experience. Ms. Boone obtained her first industry position as a systems analyst at a large Northern California trucking firm. From there, she grew into a safety director and participated in the final phases of development of the Omnibus Transportation Employee Act through her involvement with drug and alcohol legislation. Her role in bringing small to mid-sized transportation firms and school districts into compliance resulted in Ms. Boone operating her own TPA called Compliance Associates, Inc. As an industry innovator, Tammy developed her own data management and randomization software to use with Compliance Associates, Inc. Her dynamic software offers additional features that include electronic driver files, return to duty tracking, and clearinghouse compliance. So, without any further ado, Ms. Boone.
Okay, thank you. I always do this to keep myself on track here. My mind's all over the place. So my first thing is Dan Horath asked today if 382.601 is enough. The answer is no. Oftentimes what happens in a carrier is because it's expensive to onboard a driver. All of the documents are just given to the driver, nothing is explained to them, and off they go, and they don't really understand what they've committed to with your company. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about what the difference is between an actual DOT policy and a non-DOT policy. I've written tons of policies over the years. You could just about name any industry, and I've got at least one of them in my consortium. One of the most interesting policies I ever wrote was for a college program that is teaching driving. And they have a very long program, I'm happy to say. Okay, so this, I'm not going to cover each one of these because we're going to cover it throughout my talk here today. But these are all the things that you have to have in your DOT policy. So these are the categories, you can go to the next one, of what should be in a DOT and what can be in a non-DOT policy. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into a carrier because we get people ready for their inspections with DOT and or CHP. And if it's a new person that I'm doing business with, I'll ask them, can I see your policy? 9 times out of 10, they're using a company policy. It's not a DOT policy. It's not against the rules for you to have your own company policy. You can write your own company policy, but you have to make sure that the components of the policy requirements for a DOT must be included. Oftentimes what companies will do is they'll put the two policies together, or they'll have them separate, because there are several instances where a driver will come under your employer policy, not your DOT policy, okay? So for understanding purposes today, we're just gonna say DOT and employer policy, which is your non-DOT, okay? So one of the really important aspects in a DOT policy under 49 CFR 382.107 is your safety sensitive function. Your employees need to understand what the feds consider as a safety sensitive function. You can describe your own safety sensitive function in your employer policy as well. As an example, in the school ones that we've done for students, they have a much more extended description of what falls under their safety sensitive. But it's very clear in a DOT policy what the safety sensitive function is, and that should be laid out in your policy, okay? The other thing that's important, that if you're going to have separate policies or combined, you must have in the sections that are independent of DOT, that it's by independent authority, okay? Because it is not legal to do DOT requirements and testing on a non-DOT person, okay? You also need to have a policy statement. You can go ahead and go to the next. Your policy statement, I recommend that if you are just an intra-state carrier, that you add what is in the vehicle code to your policy statement. If you are just an interstate carrier, it is not as necessary. There are a plethora of problems for companies that run as intrastate, excuse me, all of a sudden they make an interstate movement because they're expanding. They're going to get caught at the scales. I had one recent individual who got stopped at the scales in Oregon. He works for a company that is registered as an intrastate carrier. He was making an interstate movement, and he had a K restriction on his license. He got lucky because the individual at the scales said, your license says you have this restriction. I can't let you pass into Oregon. I'm going to go have a cup of coffee. We'll deal with it when I get back. He makes one phone call and is told, get out of there. And how that happened also was that this driver, when he got his medical, the wrong box had been checked. It had been checked for intrastate instead of interstate. So there's a lot of things you have to be very careful with between the two factions. Okay. Your policy should always have a certificate of receipt. This is an example of the certificate of receipt that I use in my company. Like Tim, well, a lot of you weren't there, but in our last session we learned that the DERs change all the time. We're a transient industry. Our companies have transient employees besides the drivers. So you must leave a portion of your certificate of receipt to update who is your current safety director or the person who is going to be responsible for your drug and alcohol program. So we just leave a blank there and we let the carrier fill that out, okay? And basically, I'm going to tell you that most of the companies that I work with, their drivers get all of this information, and the only time that they're interested in what the policy says is when they have a positive, because they want to know what happens. So we're going to talk about the real deal today, because that's really what does happen. Okay, so education and training is huge. Whether it's your safety people doing it, your onboarding portion of your company doing it, you must explain to your drivers not only what your company requirements are, but what the DOT requirements are. One of the things that has come about with the clearinghouse, and I have to tell you, I've been in this industry 4 decades. The clearinghouse is the first program that I have seen that is actually protecting the employer. How many of you in this room have had a driver go in, have a pre-employment test, lay low for a few days, and come to your company and you find out later that they were prohibited from driving? It happened all the time. That's the one thing that the clearinghouse has taken care of. I can also tell you that when people are getting into the programs, they don't know what their policy says. They haven't been trained on it, so they need to know who to call if they have questions, which goes back to your certificate of receipt. And I can tell you that I'm usually the first call that my clients make because they don't know what the policy says because they haven't read it either, okay? It's sad but true. It's just we don't have time. We have so many regulations that we're having to comply with, and people just don't know. I realized today that I skipped one of the types of testing, and that was follow-up. So under a DOT policy, and I've listed all of the regulatory sections of what is required in a DOT policy, you have to have your follow-up testing unless you have a zero tolerance policy. Now let me tell you what happened. So when I first left the carrier that I was working for, we had a non-zero tolerance policy. But when I started my consortium, my first clients were school districts. Now, a school district normally 9 times out of 10 for the last 30 years has always had a zero tolerance policy. They don't want to get on the evening news and explain why they rehabilitated a driver and then that driver killed 84 kids on the school bus, okay? To this day, here we are in 24, I have over 200 school districts that I do business with, and I have one that doesn't have a zero tolerance policy, and I think they're insane. The problem with a zero tolerance policy is if you have a driver that has been with you, this happened to me, I'll give you a prime example. I had a driver that worked for me. He had a terrible cold. He took his daughter's codeine-laced cough syrup, and guess what? He got pulled up on a random the next day. He had a dirty test. I had a zero tolerance policy. I had to let him go. I immediately changed my policy to a non-zero tolerance policy, had him go back through the requirements, and he came back to work for me. This is before the clearinghouse and all of the SAP requirements. So you have to be mindful of how you're running your business and how you're trying to attract employees and how you're going to treat your drivers. The other thing about return to duty with drivers is that 9 times out of 10 when they get caught, they're embarrassed. They're terrified. We're an industry of gamblers, I can tell you that. Today I've heard it said several times, how can somebody get a pre-employment drug screen? Well, it's kind of a IQ test and a gambler's heart, because a lot of times they're going to roll the dice. I'm seeing more and more where the clearinghouse is taking care of this issue. If you are going to have a non-DOT policy, again, you want to say what authority, by independent authority in that, in the state of California, because we're so happy here. Most of the time, most companies will only do pre-employment and reasonable suspicion. Most of my clients won't even do post-accident anymore. They call it reasonable suspicion because it's just easier. They have their drivers sign contracts that that's okay that they do that. That is something that if you don't have and you want to have, I recommend that you speak to your attorney to find out if that's a good idea and the verbiage in your policy is acceptable, okay? So defining the SAMHSA drug panel in your policy, this is really important because fortunately, FMCSA doesn't change the regulation that often. If your policy is older than 2018, you're out of compliance, because in 2018 is when we were regulated to put the clearinghouse information into our policies. This is when the panels were changed, when we went from an opiate panel to an opioid panel. I don't recommend that you do anything in your policy in regard to the panels other than to say that it's compliant with current DOT standards. Because if you do, what's going to happen is every time that the feds want to change a panel or add something or take something away, you're going to have to update your policy. And I'm sure everybody sitting in this room knows how difficult it is to get policies out to our employees and to get everybody going on the same road, because if you have more than one policy, it's going to be difficult for your employees, okay? Also, one of the things that I've done in my company is on all of our DOT, with the exception of one contract that I have for law enforcement, we mirror the SAMHSA 5. It just makes it easier. That way, the employees don't feel like they're being discriminated against. The drivers, it just makes everything cleaner for the employer. It makes everything cleaner for your DOT policy as well. Again, if it's a non-DOT that you're doing, it'll fall under independent authority. There is always likely to be a section in your policy in regard to post-accident testing where you're going to have to address non-DOT testing, because I can tell you that 90% plus of the people that are having problems with how their policy works want to know whether a DOT test is warranted in a post-accident. What I do in my policies is I take it right out of the federal regulation of what the schedule is. It's very easy for a driver to go in and see what they have to do. But 9 times out of 10, the driver nor the employer are going to look at the policy. They're going to call me and say, hey, is this a DOT reportable? Up until, excuse me, this year, a lot of times if we were afraid that an accident was going to become a reportable, we would do a DOT test. We could reduce it down to a non-DOT, because you don't want a non-DOT event on your MIS report at the end of the year. And we're not allowed to do that without a lot of hoops to go through right now with our lab. Also, if any of you are dealing with truck driving schools, I haven't met one yet that really explains to the students what their responsibilities are. One thing that I use in my company with someone who is on a permit or in a truck driving school, if your rump's in the seat, hands on the wheel, you need to be in a drug and alcohol program, and that means they also need to have your policy. They need to understand what the regulations are. And it's very problematic with a lot of these schools because they're not explaining to these people, especially with marijuana, that while it is legal if you're driving a Class C vehicle, it is not if you are under DOT. I had last year about a dozen students that now are involved in SAP programs because the school didn't bother telling them that marijuana was illegal at the federal level. So that's another thing you have to be really careful with. I know it's kind of aside from the policy, but it's in the policy. I call the policy your ride or die document, because if you don't know what your policy says, and a driver's going to come after you because you went and tested them under DOT and it wasn't a DOT event, they're going to win. So especially in regard to DOT accidents, you have to really make sure that you know that it is a reportable accident before you do that, especially if the person ends up having a positive test. And let me tell you, it gets really ugly if they do, okay? You can, in a non-DOT policy, you can have a section in there if you want to rehab An employee, you just have to be very specific about what your EAP program offers, who's going to be responsible for it. And if you do that, I recommend that you have what we call return to duty contracts with these people. And you outline in the contract that both you and the employee sign of what will constitute a failure of the contract and or severance of their employment, okay? The other thing in a DOT policy, you do not have to pay for the rehabilitation program if a driver has a positive test, even if you have a non-zero tolerance policy. You need to state that in your policy. I recommend stating it in red. Now, if any of you in the room are under a union, oftentimes the unions will not let you do that. They force you to do rehabilitation. I have a lot of city and county entities that I work with, and they're not allowed to sever their drivers. They have to rehabilitate them. And so that has to be spelled out in your DOT policy as well. If you are dealing with multiple unions, which I have clients that do, you'll want to make sure that you have reference to those bargaining agreements so that the driver knows. What's really interesting is when I first started in this part of the industry, the unions were a little bit more lax on a return to duty and return to duty testing. Not so much these days. The unions are a lot harder on the driver when they get a positive than what a lot of employers are, which actually in my estimation is good to see. So another thing that has to be in the policy is the circumstances under which the driver will be tested for drug and alcohol. You also, as supervisors, need to know that the collection sites that you're dealing with are following the regulatory guidelines for collections. I recommend that if you don't understand that, you put that in your policy and read it, because a driver, when I do driver sessions, I tell all of them, you sign that chain of custody, it's no different than signing an escrow when you're purchasing your house. This is your document that keeps you working. And if you're not comfortable that the collection was done correctly, the procedures were not followed, you do not sign that chain of custody. And you as supervisors need to know that. You need to know how to handle that, and you need to put it in your policy what they can do to alleviate that situation or deal with it, okay? I've had situations where a driver came off the road, the guy's been on the road past his hours of service. His supervisor sent him into a collection site. He's a grumpy old guy anyway. He goes into the collection site. The collection site decides she doesn't like this guy's attitude and refuses to do his test. These are situations that will arise that your drivers will deal with, and you need to deal with it in your policy and in your procedures. Okay? Any questions yet? Okay. Not to steal your thunder, Devin, but I'm going to talk a little bit here about different things. So, because of the different types of clientele that we work with, and again, I can't say enough of how happy I am to see the clearinghouse come in, because I truly believe that it is the one program that really helps employers. I had a number of employers that really set up some interesting passcodes due to their lack of faith in our government when they were signing up for the clearinghouse. But when I would explain to them that now you have a situation where if a driver is in San Diego today, gets a dirty test, and drives up to Sacramento tomorrow or the next day, takes another test, and gets a negative, he certainly is, or she is not going to tell you they had that dirty test. But yet, if that person comes to work for you and 5 months down the road has a fatality accident in your vehicle, who do you think they're going after? They're going after the deeper pockets, which is you, not the driver, okay? So one of the things that's really what I see in my business and what I'm seeing here talking with people today, that there's better than 50% of employers that don't really understand why they need to be in the program or are even in the program, and their drivers need to. So I'm going to give you a couple little things. The carrier has their own account. When you go out to that portal account, you can, your drivers are not signing up for your portal. The drivers have a separate account. When you're employing those drivers and we do a pre-employment query on them, you can then go up into your portal under management and it will show verified or non-verified. If a driver is non-verified, that means that the driver is not enrolled in the clearinghouse program, okay? I have a fairly large explanation of the clearinghouse in the policies that I write. I have a better time explaining in person or over the telephone to a carrier or to the driver how the clearinghouse works, because they don't read it until they're positive. That is the reality of our industry. I completely get it. So one of the things that you have to know also is that just as important as it is to have that negative pre-employment, you have to have that accepted pre-employment query. I had a client that I harped on them that their drivers, both of which were in the clearinghouse, needed to accept their queries. Well, guess what? They ended up at the same scales on the same day, both with a hot load. One driver walked right in and accepted his query and was on his way. The next one was a prohibited driver. Now that creates, as a carrier, a major problem, because now your load's sitting at the scales. You're going to have to go get another driver to bring that load and get it delivered, but you're also now on the radar of CHP. And let me tell you, that's not a fun position to be in when you do something like that. In my company, the software that I've written, we, the first couple of years, I would not keep track of the carriers or the drivers' information, their email address and their codes to get into their portal account. I realized real quickly that was a mistake. We do that now because at least a couple of times a week I'll have somebody call me and say, hey, what's my login? I'm having a inspection. I need to get into my clearinghouse and show CHP that I'm in compliance with all my records. So we take care of that now. But one of the imperative things that you cover in your policy with your drivers is the clearinghouse and how to use it, okay? What I did I started with all of my people in 2018, warning them of what was going to happen in 2020. Still, we're sitting here now, 6 years later, and I still have at least 50% of my people that I'm still having to sign up. There's the people that really don't know what they're supposed to do, and then there's the people that I'm not going to do it until I absolutely have to. I don't know about you, but I know the carrier that I worked for, if we had a hot load sitting at the scales for something that wasn't done in the office, we probably got fired. And because it's a costly thing. The limit you have to do a pre-employment query on the driver when they come to work for you, okay? Another thing that has to be in your policy is a section I call it high at work. So when you can go to the next slide, JJ, thank you. One of the things I've always tried to do is to mainstream and downsize as much of the things in the policy as we can, so that it used to be that the policies were 30 and 40 pages long. Ours are 19 pages now. I always have CHP look at my policy. If I've changed it, I have my attorney look at it to make sure that everything is in there, and then I put it out. The Hyatt Work section is, as employers, we are required to give our drivers information on how drug and alcohol affects their personal life. So I made this fun little section in the policy for them to look at. It's very colorful, has funny pictures in it, and at the same time is educating them on how drugs and alcohol affect their life. So some of the other things about the drug and alcohol policies are, I at one time had a school bus driver. I knew he was dirty. We'd brought him in a couple of times, and one time he finally came into the site. He kept kicking the door open, hoping that he could get the test annulled because he felt that it wasn't correct because the door wasn't closed. Long story made short, he was dirty. He was also their union rep, interestingly, and he decided, with school districts, they have a little bit different union. They're a public employee. So because the school district did not have a good policy, they had an employer policy, not a DOT policy, he felt quite confident in going and suing the school for getting rid of him. So we get an appellate judge that actually told me that I was basically an arrogant snot and didn't know what I was talking about. And I said, well, okay. And at the break, the superintendent is having a conniption fit because they're going to have to, he thinks they're going to have to hire this employee back. And I said, they do have a re-education program for appellate judges about the Part 40 requirements. I said, let's go back in there. We will get permission to have this information in an open meeting at your next board meeting. I'll supply all of the colored paper to every person that's in your district, and we're going to tell the parents that he had a positive drug test and there were 84 kids on his bus. What do you think happened? Sorry, the driver quit. He did not want anybody to know that. Now, the school district also said, we need to change our policy. Yes, you do. And they very well have, if they did not have someone like me that understood the regulation, because the superintendent and the transportation manager did not, they probably would have let that judge make them hire that employee back when in fact he shouldn't have been working for them. So that instance is why I've always called the policy the ride or die, because if you get into a situation with a driver who's going to sue you, you better make sure that you have complied with the policy that you've written or had written or purchased. Any questions? No? I was.
Question on balance. When you mentioned about the chain of custody with if the driver goes to the collection site and he doesn't agree with the way things are doing, you mentioned that he can refuse to test them, to sign the chain of custody. Wouldn't that be reported as
it could, but then
to be tested?
yes, but the problem they'll have is that then it's a situation where it's probably going to go in front of DOT to judge whether it was a refusal or not. Refusals are very difficult. Like when we started the first year or so in the clearinghouse, if we reported a refusal, we could just report it, no big deal. It's a very big deal now. We have to do a letter. The employer has to do a letter, both on our letterheads. We have to prove that we do everything by appointments. So if somebody doesn't show up for their appointment and they call up and say, hey, I've got a broken toe or whatever. And so my staff knows they have to monitor like if somebody doesn't show up within 30 minutes of their appointment time, we're calling the carrier. Now, if a carrier says to me, oh, I forgot to tell, we've had a hectic day here, I did not notify the driver, we're good to go. If they notified the driver, then we've got a problem. But if the driver refuses, it is going to be an uphill battle, I can tell you that. I have gone to the carpet several times and oftentimes will not do business with a collection site that abuses a driver in that way. And that's another thing, that if you are doing business with a third-party administrator and consortium, you want to know how they're vetting their collection sites, how they're vetting their employees that work for them. Because if you're depending on them knowing the regulation that you're going to be enforcing, you're going to want to know they know what they're doing. It's really, really important. Anyone else?
I have another question.
Sure.
About the policies. The service provider, the third-party
Administrators.
They usually, when you open a program with them, they will give you like a binder with information, and they will give you a sample of the policy, the DOT policy. If they provide that, do they comply? Does the policy comply with the DOT policy that you mentioned?
It's incumbent on you to make sure it does. I'm not for any more regulation than the next person is, but I probably won't see it in my work lifetime, but I would really like to see consortiums and third-party administrators be regulated, because there's a lot of really good consortium and third-party administrators out there, but there's some really raunchy ones too. And it will always come back to you as the carrier. So if they give you a policy that's missing things or has combined your non-DOT with your DOT and it's not specific, you're going to have a problem.
So if it didn't change now that we have clearinghouse?
If you have not updated, 2018 is when you should have updated for the clearinghouse, and if you haven't updated for that, you need to update. Yeah. Okay. A lot changed in 2018. Not only were we getting ready for the clearinghouse and we needed to put that in our policies, but the panels were changing. That's when because honestly, when I first started my business, I used to put the panels in the policy, and I would put the cutoff levels in as well. I don't do that anymore. I just put that it's compliant with the current DOT standards, and then that way it makes it so I don't have to rewrite the policy all the time. What you should do if you're rewriting your policy, show your revision date and when you put it into play in your company. Okay. Also, if you change your policy at your next driver's meeting or your next safety meeting, I would recommend you go over that with your employees. The other thing is that if you have a zero tolerance policy and you sever employment when a driver has a positive test, they're going to panic because they're going to read in your policy that they're terminated. The only thing that you have to do as a carrier, and you state this in your policy if you wish, is that you have to give them a list of SAPs to go to, okay? What I do in my company, because oftentimes the driver will be severed, and he's out there like, oh great, now what do? I'm prohibited, I don't know who's gonna help me. My company, I'm sure there's others, but in my company, we're set up to help a driver who then has to become an owner-operator and come into our system, and then we'll do their SAP for them. This is also, believe it or not, a huge problem for students. If they get a positive when they're starting truck driving school, okay, it's scary enough hiring somebody who's only had 40 hours of training, and then you put a positive drug test on top of that. It's almost impossible for that human being to get a job. That is not right. It just is not. I have several schools that I work with, and I insist that if we're going to do work with them, They have to notify the students about the regulations, of, especially with marijuana. Those are, most of them are having marijuana positives because they're now under DOT regulation. So we do an introductory letter, welcome to our industry. One of the things that's really important too with your policy is to not look like it's a draconian document that you're trying to get rid of a driver just as you're bringing him or her on. It's a document that is protecting the driver and it's protecting you as the carrier. And in order for the two of you to get on the same plane together as a team, you need to make sure that your driver understands what's in that policy. Because I can tell you that there have been times where, like when we made changes in the policy, I'd get call after call after call. Well, what does this mean? And what if this happens? Or what if that happens? And you as the carrier have to be prepared if you are not with a knowledgeable consortium third-party administrator. You are the person who needs to know, as the DER, designated employer representative, how to answer that question or where to go to get that answer, okay? Your vendors should always be a part of your team. If they're not looking out for you, if they don't understand the regulation themselves, they're just doing a boilerplate, you're going to have a problem, I can guarantee you, okay? Because there are so many nuances in this industry that we had, especially now with the clearinghouse, that the driver has to understand, and you as carriers have to understand how to use the program. And your policy should be your document, your referral document, okay? Good questions. Anyone else? Yes?
What do you recommend having in the policy surrounding folks returning from workers' comp or leave of absence?
Oh, thank you for asking that question. So people will, the question was about people returning from work comp. The only time that you do a return to duty test on an employee is if they've had a positive test, drug or alcohol. If they are coming back from work comp, from a family leave, whatever the case may be, you have to pre-employment test them, okay? One of the things that I do in my company, it's not in the regulation, but it is something that if you are going to be on our consortium, we do, that if you take someone out for more than 30 days, you have to pre-employment test them to get back in. And the reason I do that is because we do a lot of work with casual drivers, seasonal drivers, et cetera, and it would be a nightmare for me to try to keep track of that. And so if a carrier wants to keep their drivers in, I pull a percentage rate over. When I first started my business, I do enrollment fees. Everybody said I was out of my ever-loving mind to do that, but the reason I did it that way was because I'm not out there trying to stick the carrier or stick the driver. I want them to do it right. So if they would enroll, it paid for all of their testing, so they would pre-employment again when they were supposed to, because it wasn't going to cost them anything, okay? The other thing is, if a driver is out and they miss the random draw, they have to pre-employment test again, because if they weren't in the random, they're out. Like for instance, I go through contract renewals in December. All my contracts expire on December 31st, and generally everybody has about a 7-day grace period, because it takes me that long to get people that are waiting to the last minute in the last quarter to do their testing and get all my statistical information in. Once I pull that random, they're done. They have to start all over from scratch. Everybody has to pre-employment test again. I can guarantee you, if it's a company that has multiple drivers, it only happens once. So it's not a good situation.
You do a pre-employment query in the clearinghouse to bring it back to?
Yes, absolutely. The other thing is, if you change consortiums, one of the things that you should look at is whether or not they're going to pick up any of the, like say you're going to change your consortium tomorrow. So here we are now in March, which means we're almost at the end of the first quarter. Potentially you've had tests done. So those tests should be provided to your new provider so that they can provide a correct annual summary for you. Thank God we don't have to do the quarterly reports anymore. We do semi-annual reports, and then we do the calendar summary and MIS report. And the MIS report is what the feds use. They do a random draw of carriers, and you'll get notified with that, and generally by March 15th is when you have to provide that document. Now, I know there's a lot of consortiums that do not provide statistical reports. If you are with one of those consortiums, my advice to you is run, because they should be doing the reports. They're doing your tests for you. You also should be provided with your chain of custody with your test results, because if you go through an inspection, you're going to be asked for those. Drivers come in all the time. What do I do with this? The donor copy goes to the driver. It's their document that shows that they showed up for their test. The first year I opened my business, I sent the employer documents to the employer. Oh boy, that was a mistake, because the next year I was getting phone calls, oh, I need copies of this, this, and this specimen ID, and I didn't have them because I had sent them to the employers. So in my company, I keep those, but I take a copy of the employer copy and attach it with your tests, because you do have to have that in an inspection, okay? Yeah?
Is that ECCF copy for the employer needs to be the employee file or the company file?
That's a good question. So you must show the pre-employment test in their driver qualification file. Your randoms and whatnot should be separate. They should not be in the driver files at all, okay? So when you're keeping track of your randoms, what I recommend you do is you have a separate binder for that, and then when you get your semi-annuals and your annual report, you have all of the test results that match those reports. I actually caught a person in a situation. It took 7 years, but this person actually went to prison because she was playing God. She was taking money for tests, and she was deciding who was dirty and who wasn't, and she was still charging the carriers. And one of the carriers who was in her program had failed his inspection with CHP. He came to see me, and one of the first things is I saw that the driver's name was spelled wrong. And so I called the MRO service and said, hey, we need to get these results corrected. And the rest is history, basically. We went after her when it was found out that she never did send any of the tests into the lab. She didn't even have a lab account. So the other thing is, as carriers that you need to pay attention to when you do get your results, you need to make sure that your consortium has put your driver's name on there correctly, their CDL is on there correctly. If they're still putting the social security number on there, you need to correct that. Social security number does not belong on the test anymore. It has to have their CDL on there, okay? And then you get your chain of custody, all right?
You mentioned something about vitamins. I missed that.
The driver files?
Yeah, in the driver
Yeah.
qualification file.
So as a carrier, if you have drivers, you have to have driver qualification files. And one of the things that has to go into the qualification file is their pre-employment test. Also, I recommend that you put their pre-employment query copy in there as well to have proof that you did it.
Wouldn't that be in a separate file for drug and alcohol file?
It would be separate. Yeah, your drug and alcohol, your randoms and follow-ups and all that are separate from your driver qualification. The only drug test that goes into your DQ file is the pre-employment test. Make sense? Okay. No, it's okay. So when you hire a driver, there's a myriad of things that you have to do in a background check. And actually it's kind of interesting because we do these annuals in the clearinghouse. That's all part and parcel of having a driver file. You're supposed to look at the driver file once a year to make sure that everything in there is up to date and correct. Do they have a current CDL? Do they have a current medical, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that has to be in this qualification file is that you did your due diligence and pre-employment tested them and ran a query on them. So in the DQ files that I do, I put the pre-employment test, I put the query, and I put the query release form in there as well. So I don't have to go digging for those later, okay?
The reason of my question is that when they do an inspection or an audit on a company, you show the files, they will require to be separated from driver qualification file will be everything related to the driver, right? The application for employment and driver license and everything. And then a separate file will be everything related to drug and alcohol and clearinghouse.
Yes.
And the reason why is because that's completely confidential and it will be in a separate
You are correct. Both of those are to be confidential. So the driver qualification file that has the pre-employment test in it is separate, and it has to be basically under lock and key. It can't be available to everyone. And then your drug and alcohol program, which is your randoms and any other tests that you're doing, go into a separate file. Another thing that should be in your policy also is how long you keep your tests. Because if you have a driver that you have rehabilitated or you've had positives, they have a different record keeping length of time than just a pre-employment does. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Going back to the driver's license number and not the social security number, where's that regulation on?
You know, if you'll give me your card, I'll send it to you, but it changed in, I believe it was 2018 at the same time that the chain of custody's all changed, where you have to put the faction, whether it's FMCSA or USGG, whatever, on. That's when the requirement came in for the CDL. It's about the same time that the clearinghouse came in.
That's how we do it now, but we may be changing to a new vendor. That's we're kind of having an argument with them in regards to using their social security number and their driver's license, where we're telling them no, it has to be the driver's license.
Yeah.
So if I can.
I'll be happy to help you with that. In my computer system, I put them into my system by their social security number because I work with companies that might have 2 or 3, 4 generations of a family that have the same name. And the only way we can differentiate them is by their social security number, but everything else is done by their driver's license. I had one guy come in one day, he was very mad. He said, "I'm not giving you my social security." And I said, "Okay, you want to give me your driver's license?" "Sure." I said, "Thank you, I can find out way more about you on your driver's license." He was like, "Oh, yeah."
Besides that, we have trans-border companies and our Mexican drivers, they don't have a social security number. So that will be only the thing that you can use is the driver license.
So if they are not U.S. citizens, what documentation do you get from them?
The driver license.
Their CDL, and do you get like a lot of them come in now with their passports to prove who they are. Because that's another thing, we do not let anybody test without identification. If you come in and you tell me you're Joe Smo from ABC Trucking, but you don't have, I can't believe how many drivers drive around without their wallets, you're not going to get a test. I have to be able to see that this is who you are. Okay? Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. If any of you, I have cards if any of you need them and would like to ask me a question later or want to catch up with me later, I'll be here through tomorrow, and I appreciate your time and attendance. Thank you very much.